Welcome back to Island Bike Life. Today, we're going to be taking a look at the 2019 Evil the Calling. I got this bike during my trip down to Sedona, Arizona earlier this year. I was set up with this bike from the fellows over at Over the Edge Cycles. They're located right in the heart of Sedona and offer a great variety of brands, not just Evil. Don't overlook this shop. They're a really great group of guys that went above and beyond and took great care of our group during our trip there this March. I took this bike on a variety of trails in and around Sedona, from some pretty classic cross-country and trail riding environments, a little bit of technical climbing, and including some pretty fun descents. The bike that I was set up with was an extra large and fit me absolutely perfectly. The geometry on the Evil Calling is pretty fun. It allows for pretty rowdy descents, reasonable climbing efficiency, and overall a pretty nimble and poppy bike. They put this bike out there as being a two-wheeled skateboard, and though I don't skate myself, I kind of get what they're trying to say because it really is a lot of fun, and the geometry surrounding that does lend to that characteristic. Like most Evil bikes, and a lot of bikes these days for that matter, they can be set up in a high or a low setting. Evil tries to be pretty funny and calls it a low and extra low setting. I ran mine in the low. With that, it resulted in a head tube angle of right around 66.5 degrees with a pretty good C-tube at 75 degrees or just about. The wheelbase on this guy on an extra large is a little bit on the long side, but certainly not as long as my everyday bike. It was at about 12.18. The overall stack and reach height numbers for my body height at 6'1" or 6'2" with a 33-inch inseam fit just about right. My reach was 474 on this bike, and anywhere between 470 and 480 for me right now feels pretty solid, and I was overall very happy with that. The Evil sizing chart would put this bike for somebody who's a little bit taller than me in general, but I felt right at home on this bike right away. As for the kit on this one, it was their high-end X01 build. Evil kind of only does two, an entry-level GX and a high-end X01, which doesn't really spare any expense on the part list. The suspension duty on this bike is split with the 150 fork up front with 130 mils of rear travel. The shock and fork are both from RockShox, the front being a Lyric with a Charger 2 RC2 damper, and the rear being a Super Deluxe RC3. It's a full X01 group set on this bike, including the cranks, the shifter, the derailleur, and the cassette, and was paired on this particular bike to Guide RSC brakes, though the most current build kit comes with G2s. The wheels on this particular bike were great. They were very responsive E13s with E13 hubs, which I've come to find to be very reliable and feel really good. The cockpit is put together with a set of race face, bar, and stem, and overall the build kit is pretty good. It's one of those build kits that is pretty standard across the board on most bikes, and the one thing that is pretty interesting on this is that they're making this bike being a little bit more rowdier. They put a Lyric up front instead of a Pike, which they could have done, and it kind of gives you an idea of what they're trying to do with this bike, and really it kind of fits in with the ethos of what Evil bikes are. The climbing on this guy didn't really surprise me. More often than not, Delta Link bikes I find don't pedal all that well. Even the following MB, which is their sort of lowest travel 29er bike. I've come to expect that out of the bike, so I don't really consider it to necessarily be a negative. I had found that it tends to be just the type of leverage ratio and anti-squat that they get out of the Delta Link. Though the pedaling on this bike was really put to the test, almost more so than the descending, especially in Sedona, where there's not a lot of extended, really long downhill. It's really more of a general trail riding and cross-country type of riding network. And over the 2.5 days that I had this bike, I never really complained or locked out the suspension once. It pedaled really good for a 130 mil travel bike. It wasn't overly stiff, and it didn't necessarily give me that sort of supportive pedaling feel that you might expect out of a 130 mil trail bike. The trade-off for that though is that it's a very fun bike and a very poppy and responsive bike when it came to trail riding. So when it came to the overall climbing, while it wasn't certainly what I would consider to be an overly efficient bike, because of the positive pedaling position based on the head tube and the C-tube angles and the overall lightness and feel of the bike, it never really bothered me, or I wouldn't consider it a hindrance. Certainly not the best, but not the worst pedaling bike that I've been on by far. The trail riding category truly is where this bike, at least for me in the riding area that I had it on, really started to shine. I'm just going to put it out there, probably top 3, if not top 2 funnest bikes I've ever been on. The suspension setup with the RockShox and that Delta Link in a trail riding environment really does lend itself to just being a damn good time. I was a little bit apprehensive about this bike. I hadn't ridden 27.5 wheels, and it wasn't a bike that I was really overly jazzed about going into the shop when I went to arrange my demo. I'm very glad, and I can say absolutely that my first expectations were completely wrong. And it was the trail riding category that did it for me with the Evil Calling. This bike just loves to have fun. It rolls over the trail really nicely. It's very responsive and encouraged me to really try to find little rocks and not so much roots in Arizona, that's for sure, but little trail features that were naturally occurring to pop off of and get little bits of air whenever I could. The mid and end stroke support, just like on all Delta Link bikes that I've ridden, is really quite supportive. And that's where this sort of trade-off comes for the pedaling. It allowed me to kind of crash through and roll into things a little bit harder than maybe another 130 mil bike might suggest that you should. And it absolutely ate it up. It was no problem whatsoever. And in fact, the harder I pushed this bike in and over rocky and chunky terrain or in and out of corners, the more it rewarded me with a good time. So like I say, the trail riding category for this review really for me is where the Calling outshines a lot of bikes in this sort of trail category, and was just a damn good time. When it came to the descending, it didn't disappoint me whatsoever. That sort of fun feeling and stability that I felt in trail riding situations translated pretty well over to the descents. In fairness, I never encountered any descents that I would really consider similar to what I'm used to riding here in the Pacific Northwest. Some of them were a little bit janky with big rocks or larger rock gardens, but they were never really extended in nature. They were never really overly fast, and a lot of these trails in Arizona were built really before mountain biking was a thing, and so you're kind of retrofitting hiking trails to mountain biking, and so they're not exactly the same. It's not a apples to apples comparison. All that being said though, I can translate what I did experience in the trails that I did have this thing on in Arizona to what I have ridden here, and I can say without a shadow of a doubt this bike would perform very well in the Pacific Northwest. I think that it is a very fun and planted feeling bike that if you want to, that's going to really reward you for trying to find lines that are a little bit less traveled. It really wants you to hammer into things and jump off things, but it's not going to feel skittish when you do that. But overall, the descending on the Evil Calling really was great. I'd give it good marks, that's for sure. It was very confidence inspiring, and I had a lot of fun. And I really would like to try it back here on my home trails to really get a sense of what this thing can do. When you look at this bike in its comparative category, like most Evils, they're a little bit of a boutique brand. There's not a lot of dealers locally here on Vancouver Island. Beaufort Cycles is the only real major dealer here. So if you're looking for one, go see those guys. But like other boutique brands like Yeti, Santa Cruz, to a lesser degree Trek and Specialized, you're going to pay a little bit more for this type of bike. No, you're not getting a Rocky Mountain. It's going to save you some money on the same sort of build kit. But what you are going to get is a pretty good attention to detail. You're getting a very unique suspension setup with a Delta Link, a very burly, well-built bike, fully carbon frame with really good warranty, and now offering direct sales to Canada here from the website, which is brand new as of only a couple of months ago. So what are my final thoughts on the Evil Calling? I really like this bike a lot. I think it'd be a really good bike for around my home trails here on Vancouver Island. It's a really fun bike, 150 up front, 130. It's super fun and poppy. It's probably, like I said already, one of the funnest bikes I've ever been on. And I can't really explain all of the intangibles as to why that is. It's really just that whole package. It's a fun bike. It's a pretty burly bike in and around the linkage where the Delta is, the head tube, the down tube, the top tube. Everything is really sturdy and really well built. Lots of carbon everywhere, but it's not overly heavy. It moves around the trail really well. It's really responsive and it fit me really nice. Just the specifics on the angles of the head tube, the C tube, and the reach numbers really fit me just about perfect. My arms are a little bit longer than my legs would suggest, and sometimes things don't fit right, but that wasn't the case here. For a Pacific Northwest bike, the Evil Calling would absolutely get my recommendation. I think just about anything we have here on the island, this thing will gobble up and have a hell of a time doing it. Well, I hope you like this look at the 2019 Evil Calling. If you like what I'm doing here, think about hitting subscribe and the like button. Leave me a comment down below and come and find me on Instagram. And as always, thanks again for watching, and let's go hit the trail.